Okay, welcome to episode 30. Can you believe it? We're already there. So we wanted to make this special. And we invited a friend that we've known for a while who's doing an interesting thing right now. She's writing a book that you'll be able to find in Amazon soon. The current title is Still Evolving. The secondary title is Rethinking the Title, but it will have a real title eventually. Just look up Sheila Jaganathan at the World Bank and you'll see Chris Dede has a chapter in it, and many other people, including the Moodle man, the inventor of Moodle, and other folks that have been big players in the space of open and online education for a while. And Sheila knows everyone. She touches a lot of people in her work, from policymakers to instructional designers, to instructors, to researchers and evaluators. And she's interested in a plethora of issues in education that are impacting us all, whether it's AI in education, or massive open online education, or MOOCs, or social media, social-based learning approaches, talent management in the corporate sector. There's a whole slew of things that she's been kind of interested in, making a dent in, including poverty, including literacy skills of youth around the world. And I first had a chance to meet with her in the early 2000s when she did a chapter in my handbook of blended learning. And since then, she's done a couple more chapters for me about MOOCs and open education. So you can pretty much ask any question you want in the field of education and she will know something, or she will find out about it. That's what's special about today. Sheila is the head of the Open Learning Campus at the World Bank, which was not her title a couple of years ago. So she can tell us a little bit about how she evolved at the World Bank and what has happened in creating different aspects of openness and online and distance education for different marginalized populations around the world to get them access and opportunities in an educational space that they didn't have previously. And so maybe you can read her bio that's in Silver Lining for Learning. I won't have to talk more about it, but she's going to share some slides with us. But before she does that, Sheila, could you tell us briefly about your evolution over the past couple of decades at the World Bank, what you've been involved with, and what it's come to today, where you're at today?
Thank you, Kurt, and Professor Dede and Professor Mishra and the whole team for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts around overall the field of digital and blended learning and education more generally. So I would be at the World Bank. I'm currently the global head of learning and capacity building, having launched what we call the Open Learning Campus. But I really think of myself as the nexus of education and technology. And so anyone has a question, even within the World Bank, I might be the point person, at least a starting point. But basically, I've been in the bank for 20 years. And that was a time when e-learning and digital learning wasn't even thought of. Although my own background, I was actually, believe it or not, interning with Seymour Papert at MIT. And I don't even want to tell you the date that happened because it kind of dates me. But somehow went along the line of technology and education for my master's and doctoral work. But anyway, I did a few other things. And then landed up at the bank 20 years ago at a time when there were a network of video conferencing centers. That was the biggest way to connect different countries and different policymakers. And I landed at the right time at the right place because that was exactly the time when we needed to start thinking of something beyond video conferencing, because there are a lot of constraints of video conferencing being in capital cities, huge investments and so on. And that was when I joined the bank and started to gradually introduce e-learning and digital learning. After about 6 or 7 years of piloting and so on, I launched something called the E-Institute for Development, largely targeted towards policymakers and practitioners and development actors around the world, including emerging countries, but also developed countries who were interested in international development. And that was for a few sectors. And the appetite of our clients was just right. People started to make that transition from wanting live, either in-person learning in economics and international development, or some sort of video conference, to actually virtual learning and blended learning. So when that went very, very well, I was given the mandate to set up and launch the Open Learning Campus, which combines both learning for the staff, about 40,000 staff in 100 countries, so that they're cutting edge in all of the areas they advise their clients, and also our client base, which I talked to you about. And so that's where we are. Today, we have an Open Learning Campus. I'll give you a few details on the uptake when I share a few slides, but that's where we are. And it's a very, very exciting journey, because this world keeps changing. And I think it's our job as people in the space to continue to innovate around that.
Now, wait a minute, Sheila. Are you telling us that you were influenced by Seymour Papert?
Yes.
And then you were influenced by Chris Dede. And
yes.
Then you're influenced by the Moodle man, Martin Tobias.
And yourself,
and now you've got Punya, and you've got Young Zhao. You've been involved in some of the major players in the space for a long time. I mean, I'm serious. You know, Seymour Papert is the reason many of us are here. Actually, are extending his work, or he's still impacting us today in our thinking, even though he's no longer with us. You know, so it's. I'm really glad you brought up Papert. You're the first one in our 30 episodes, I think, who has. So maybe we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I think I want you to share your first 5-minute set of slides with us, and then we'll go around and ask some questions. Okay?
Sorry, can you see that?
Oh yeah.
Great. Just plugging this in. Great. So I wanted to very briefly talk about, all we're thinking of before I go to talking about what we're doing in learning and so on. In today's context, it's COVID. And the World Bank is working with about 100 countries as we speak on some broad-based approaches to responding to COVID. And so the first one is around building a more resilient recovery, facilitate faster and more equitable growth when the health crisis subsides. But again, currently all of the funding and the efforts are centered around saving lives and helping countries offer sort of health facilities, support the health teams, have exchanges between countries who are doing well. So for example, we had during the pandemic, we launched several knowledge sharing sessions with countries like Korea and the others in the region on how they were handling things and so on. So that's one area. And then, of course, the focus is on the poorest of the poor and saving the poor and the vulnerable and expanding their reach and so on. So social protection, tackling food shortage. In that regard, I want to say that as we speak, I think on Wednesday, we close a MOOC on one of the World Development Reports called Trading for Development. And this includes all the supply chain crises and so on, which was very timely during the MOOC. And then the fourth, of course, is saving jobs in businesses, especially as 4 out of 5 people in the global workforce are currently affected, and the informal sector, particularly in continents like Africa, is very. So I gave you the big picture of where the bank is engaged in during COVID, and we're constantly following on the footstep of the bank's either lessons learned, sharing of information, South-South learning, where the capacity building programs that we put out accompany the financial commitments around these 4 areas. So quickly moving along, why does the bank care about learning? So 1.2 billion people continue to live in extreme poverty. So business as usual is, even pre-COVID, this was a situation. So business as usual is not an option. And about 3 years ago, the bank's president set out 2 ambitious goals. One, end poverty, and really reduce the number of people living under the poverty line to less, which is really $1.25 a day, to about 3% by 2030, around the same time as the SDG, that we have to meet the SDGs. And the second one is around sharing prosperity with the bottom of the pyramid. So foster income growth of the bottom of the pyramid, which is about 40% of the population. So these are the broad goals that the bank is striving towards. Now, knowledge and learning is front and center of this, because not only does this vision, I mean, people are no longer money, you can get financing from many sources, but not only the regional bank, like the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank for Latin America, and so many banks. And now you've got the new banks that have come in, like the BRICS Bank, and also the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, who all do the role of the World Bank, either by sector or by region. And so financing is not the most important, is the realization that has come about. Learning, innovation, and collaborators are key accelerators in eradicating poverty in a finance-constrained world. And the World Bank is role as a convener of such knowledge, lessons learned, failures, what to do and what could be improved, is a huge knowledge base that they collect on all of the projects that we deliver with our client countries. And so these are integrated, evidence-based, global local solutions that we try to package to make available in our capacity building program. So this is why learning is front and center. So with these goals, I gave you a little bit of the history. The picture shows you, we launched the Open Learning Campus about 7 or 8 years ago after some precursors. You've got Jim Yong Kim, who was our president then. You've got Thomas Friedman. I'd invited him because he was writing a lot about globalization. And then I've got Anand Agarwal in a sort of a launch community. I talked to you about the goal of the Open Learning Campus, the vision would be as the go-to destination for development learning. And it has 2 sub-goals: ensure that our staff are cutting edge. And then the second goal is that we co-create solutions, whether it's on poverty reduction or energy or climate adaptation, with our client countries. So what the Open Learning Campus did, and it's an ecosystem for learning where most of it is digital and blended, but we still do some in-person pre-COVID in regional networks and so on. But what this did when we launched it was, for client learning in 2011, we went from almost 95% face-to-face and 5% video conference to almost 98% digital and blended. So that was the contribution that our team has been able to do. And this just gives these numbers. In fact, this gets outdated as we speak because we have a lot of eyeballs on the Open Learning Campus all the time, including from Africa. So this gives you a little bit of a look and feel of what the OLC, as we call it. At the point when we launched it, I had advisors like Sal Khan at the Khan Institute and so many other places. I had talked to Kurt. We got Silicon Valley involved and so on. And so we got a very interesting and interactive and an engaging place to learn. But I wanted, sorry. I wanted to just share one thing, which is we looked at learning for a busy practitioner who doesn't have much time during the day to learn. And so we kind of broke it into 4 different schools, a sort of a bite-sized micro-learning schools, which uses storytelling and everything to come. So let's say a policymaker needs to meet with the Minister of Environment to discuss a climate change mitigation policy. They learn for about 15 minutes to an hour to get up to speed before they meet the minister. So that's all the bite-sized learning school. And then the academy is the deeper learning, so people need to learn. So then that same practitioner may decide to take a MOOC on why a 4-degree warmer world is to be avoided on climate change. And here we have the MOOCs, the face-to-face, the facilitated e-learning, the self-data. And then very important for development learning is the WBC, which is the Connect, crowdsourcing ideas. Mayors, recently we brought together mayors all over the world, Barcelona, Mumbai, Boston, so that they could exchange how to deal with cities during COVID. So this is very important too, because within development learning, there's no learner or expert. Everybody's an expert because they bring a wealth of knowledge. And the last column, of course, is largely for staff, which is they learn on the job and so on. So I'll stop here, give you an idea of why an open learning campus for the World Bank, and also what it is. I can go into examples later, but I'll stop here.
I was just going to stop you at that point anyway. Perfect timing. I know Punya has a question. I've just checked the chat, and my God, there's a whole bunch of issues being raised and deep thoughts. We're not. Well, this might be a really deep discussion here. But Punya first, and then follow up with Chris, and then we'll see what we have on the chat.
Are we going to do one question at a time, or do you want to gather a couple, or how do you want to do it?
One at a time. Let's go.
Okay.
One at a time.
And yeah, so. Actually, I mean, before we go into the learning aspect, I thought there was something unique in what you spoke about, which is that you are sort of in a unique position to look across the landscape, across education, government, nonprofits, businesses. So one of the themes that drives this, and I think we will come back to it specifically with relevance to education, is this idea that this COVID-19 crisis offers us some opportunities, possibly some silver linings here. So from in a broader scale, looking across the landscape, what are you seeing some positives or some silver linings that may be emerging that are not just restricted to education, but broadly speaking? I was just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. And again, everything I say are my views, not about the views of the institution I work in.
That is, I have to say, Sheila, that is true for all of us here.
Yes, yes, that's why I didn't say it before. But no, I was reminded about that because for my book, I was getting a visual from UN permission. And they made it clear to say, put it bright and clear in the book that this is your view and not the view of the UN or the World Bank. Anyway, so interesting question, Punya. And I'll start with learning and perhaps share some other things because so with learning, no doubt it has been a silver lining. And I actually learned about this series initially from Chris because we were interacting on the book. And I thought to myself, what an amazing way to capture what's going on in our world. So for example, in the World Bank's, both the staff and the client, this is the only tool available. So not only so let me speak about the clients first because we had invested in a digital infrastructure, as I told you, over 10 years ago. So most of our client learning was happening. And so people really, it's multiplied manyfold and people have come to expect this. Now, of course, we had blended, but now the blended becomes between a blend of tools within an entirely virtual world. So that is happening. The staff is a little bit more tricky because while 97% of our client had pivoted to digital and blended, the staff was 50-50. Staff were still privileged enough to want to have in-person learning and so on. So it was harder to move them. And so there, although it was a silver lining and we had everything, mindset change became important because, it's not about having a Zoom after Zoom after Zoom. Design becomes extremely important. In maintaining the interactivity, the participatory nature of the conversation and so on becomes very important. So just to summarize, for education, capacity building, it's a no-brainer. It's just, if I had worked 10 years to make people take notice of the OLC, the COVID did that in 2 months. So it really raised our profile. One other unique aspect to respond to Punya is, so I talked a bit about the capacity building learning side, but then, the World Bank's job is, outside of learning. Our teams, we call them task team leaders and other experts, subject experts, technical experts, they would spend almost 100 to 150 days traveling to the various countries, designing programs, a water and sanitation program or a water utility program or what have you, to countries. And so that came to a standstill. And so we're using a lot of the collaborative and social tools, and I'm being called to advise how to use them for what we call mission operational projects. So we're using VR, for example, for a before and after project, for remote supervision and so on. So that is also changing the nature of how the bank does business beyond learning. And I think that is across all sectors. I joined in a webinar organized by the bank on how, all of the sort of large buildings downtown in many of the cities are going to wind down to becoming sort of technology parks in the suburbs, and how travel is going to come down. And I also see my son's a neurosurgeon, and from what he tells me and my own medical thing, the medicine is also going to change in a big way. I think, a lot can be achieved virtually. So, lots of different areas where we actually have to sit and reflect on where the in-person exchange and interaction is going to be important and use that rather than randomly use in person. And that's the whole point of post-COVID. Perhaps we're going to be in a blended learning situation. And so we'll have to think about how do we redefine the physical spaces.
Yeah. So thank you, Sheila, for that. I mean, that's very helpful for us to think of the bigger picture. But I think one of the consequences of that means we have to rethink how we train architects. We have to rethink how we train medical professionals, because the nature of interaction itself changes. And it's also, I think, part of how we sort of train the broader citizenry to also start seeing these opportunities. So I loved that graphic that you showed from sort of I don't remember the exact words, but from the micro to, that the learning experiences can range across, and then through that can actually become customizable. I mean, we are looking at lots of sort of, discussions on micro credentials and so on, which suddenly now seem a lot more real. So I could go on about this because we are doing some interesting work around sort of community-based education here at ASU that I think touches on that. But I think Chris might have a question, and I'll let him.
Punya, I just want to mention that I was telling Kurt, I had met your President Cook because he was a great friend of our President Kim. And so, I was very, very impressed at his vision. This was about 4 years ago, where he talked about all of this.
Yeah, this is Michael Crow, and he is a unique individual in terms of just his vision, not just for ASU as an university, but sort of broader role of higher education within sort of the democratic and the social context and economic context.
And we had actually invited him for a fireside chat with our president. And I mean, people were bowled over by his vision and ideas. So
are we all, Chris,
I was going to recommend him as a guest, Punya, if you think it's appropriate, but we can talk about that during our reflection week. Sheila, you've been an expert at blended since I met you, and we were in Lugano, Switzerland in 2004, having lunch together. I think it was talking about hybrid or blended learning at the time, and I knew you before that. So these must be unique times to see the world catch up with what you know and what you're doing. And the respect must be coming across all departments and sectors of the World Bank. And I'll come back to that, think about that, but we all go to Chris. Chris has a question.
Yeah, so all of us who co-founded this initiative share a belief with you, which is that technology-enabled innovations can play a big role in improving learning in both global North and global South countries. And we've looked at many examples of that across the 30 episodes so far. But we've also, in our meetings occasionally, where the co-hosts reflect, have identified the failure to scale as a huge problem. Again and again, we look at these really powerful things happening bottom up and not really scaling to the extent that they merit, and not really being sustained to the extent that they merit. And of course, we're worried that as the pandemic recedes, some of these innovations will recede along with it instead of helping to build a new model. So I think capacity building for adults is exactly right in terms of thinking about this issue of scale, that it may not be sufficient, but it's certainly necessary to have that take place. And yet, as I look at capacity building, again, in both global North and global South, related to technology, too often the technology is seen as the content of the capacity building. So we say, if only folks were using technology, then magic would happen, right? One laptop per child, right? Well, we know that that doesn't work. Technology is not the innovation, it's the catalyst. So as you think about the fact that yes, people need to know how to use technology, but what they really need is ideas about new models of teaching and learning that are needed for the 21st century and that technology can help to make possible. How does that come through in the different kinds of capacity building that your work enables?
Thanks. That's really a question right after my heart, because I'm more a pedagogue at heart than a technologist. So you bring up a very good point in that, I look at, technology is certainly, you put it well, a catalyst, but there is other pillars in order to build a good program at this level of a course or a program. Of course, if you're thinking institution, there are many more things, but I think you need innovative pedagogies. You need a good set of technology that will enable you to convey this pedagogy to the right audience. And of course, you also need some very good cross-sectoral content, because having the pedagogy and technology, but the content is not cutting edge or appreciative. So I think that is very important. And for most of our programs, that's what we strive for. In addition, of course, you need to make all of this a little bit more learner-centered and not centered around what the experts want to communicate. And so that's a whole area in itself. And plus scaffolding the learner, of course, with the appropriate tools so that you help them transition to this new learning world. So in terms of innovative pedagogies, some of the ideas that are important to us is, of course, experiential learning. So it's not about, especially because of the topics we're dealing with, it's not math or computer science where you have a right or wrong answer. So experiential learning, a lot of case-based, exploration of topics, whether it's around agriculture or so on and so forth. And also the peer-to-peer knowledge exchange. So in each and every one of our activities, we will have the pedagogically structured peer interactions, because it's important, whether it's face-to-face, but I'm now talking largely about virtual and blended, it's not going to happen organically unless it's planned in the pedagogy. So these are some of the ideas. Now, of course, we sort of tweak it and do different things, scenario-based. I'm also looking into this area, and perhaps I'd love to do some more is, for example, in development, a lot of it is based on data, and we've got practitioners, right? So I'm also exploring a model where you look at really data and learn from it, be it water, be it environment, be it health, be it macroeconomics. And so embedding somewhat the available data in a city, in a country, a region, in a subset, and then learning from real-time data. So these are ways where it's not a one-off, pouring content. So that's something we've moved away a lot. There will be occasional stuff when we're dealing with the practitioners who don't want to invest the time. And remember, I did mention the mindset. So when we get providers of learning, the hard part is to educate them that it's the innovative pedagogy that we need to focus, because, if you don't have that, then you're not going to have a successful learning experience. Yeah.
So Sheila, we have a series of questions coming in on the side. And if you notice me running, I ran back to my back room. I got the poster still from 3 years ago at the eLearn conference that I stole that has your picture on it somewhere.
I know. You're one of the most organized people I know, Kurt. I can't find one from 1 week to another. You remember dates, you have all the artifacts.
This has been sitting in my dining room just for 3 years, just so I could show that, actually. Really. So Maureen has questions, Gerald has questions. Let's go to Gerald first. I'm sorry, Maureen, but I think Gerald's question we need to bring up first is, how does the World Bank, how does the work of the World Bank filter down to individuals in the developing world? Say a young person wants to start a preschool in Kigali. What happens? What happens with
Okay, I'll answer that, and you may not like the answer I give, but the World Bank, as I said before, our main target audience are policymakers and practitioners and leaders and other development actors. So most of our capacity or capability building is for that group. And the idea being that the World Bank cannot influence every single citizen, but we could influence policymakers who make better policy for education or what have you, right? So that's our target audience. But having said that, we do have some products, such as many of our MOOCs, which are open to, even the other products are open to everybody, but it's not targeted towards them. But many of our MOOCs, we have 2 tracks. We have a policymaker track, and then we have a general champion track, which is the youth, the citizen, it's a public good exercise. And so that is what we're not directly targeting every single citizen. That won't be possible. But there are some products. And I would advise, who was the person who asked the question?
Gerald.
Gerald. So go take a look at the olc.worldbank.org, and it gets updated with new learning almost every day. And so you will still find something for the public and the general citizen, but the target is who I mentioned.
So Maureen has a couple of questions. First of all, she says, what was the name of the bank group that serves the African continent? And she also asks, how do these gigantic goals filter down to the ground level with the folks who just subsist on $1.25 a day?
I think the second part of the question I did answer with Gerald's question, that again, we're not targeting our programs to that. Even if you look at our operations, which deals with loans and other kind of activities, we're not targeting the person who subsists on $0.25 a day. We're again dealing with the governments, the policymakers, and the practitioners who will help their citizen get out of that poverty line. So that's the thing. In terms of the group that works with the African continent, the World Bank is broadly divided into regions. So we have Africa, which is the group, a whole group of about 500 to 700 people just working on Africa continent. Then we have what is called Middle East and North Africa, and their focus is on that. Then we have Latin America and the Caribbean, their focus, South Asia, East Asia, and then we have Europe and Central Asia. So this is how we're broken. Now, I have the good fortune of working across all of the regions. So that's the fun part, because learning cuts across. But in terms of the actual operational work, that's how they're divided. And we have country offices in 100 countries. So if you ask me the question, how do you pick to do a MOOC on trading for development, or how do you pick to do a facilitated e-learning course on solid waste management? And the way we pick that is the country offices have a 5-year framework where they work with the prime ministers of the countries and the finance to say, what are your key challenges and what can how can the World Bank help? So that's the level it starts. And then that's related to the loans and other things. So for example, in India, the Prime Minister Modi met with our World Bank president, and then Prime Minister Modi said, we want the World Bank help on skilling. We want the World Bank's help on water and sanitation to help us with the open defecation problem. And I don't remember what else. So these translated into billion-dollar loans. And then from that, the learning follows suit. So that's how we come to the capacity building efforts.
Wow. Let's go to Chris. Chris, you have something for Sheila.
Well, I've had some interactions with policymakers in global South countries, and I have a theory of change, and I want to run it by you, and you can feel free to disagree and correct my thinking, but I found those conversations at times frustrating because they seem to have a pipeline view of history. So someone came up to me at an OECD meeting, and when they found out I was from Harvard, they said, well, we need 10 Harvards in our country. And I said, you don't even need one Harvard in your country. That is not what you need. I said it a little more politely, but that was certainly what I was thinking. And they seem to feel that the global South has to follow the global North in going through an industrial model of education where there's an elementary school every 3 miles and a higher education campus every 30 miles. And we repeat all the mistakes and problems. And I said, the first truly 21st century educational system will probably happen in a global South country that has the vision to achieve it, because you don't have all these legacy industrial era educational institutions that are fighting tooth and nail to block any attempt to innovate because it cuts into their model. And so first, I don't know if you would agree or disagree with that. And second, if you do agree, at least to some extent, how do you try to influence policymakers not to try to use the standards that a developed country might make and the structures that a developed country might have as their goal for where they should take their country?
Thank you, Chris. I mean, that's a complicated question, and I will scratch the surface. I think I would have agreed with you a lot more maybe 5 to 7 years earlier. Interestingly, Tony Bates, whom I interviewed for our book, also made a similar comment. But I think a little bit, I have a slightly different view, only because maybe they also consider me an insider, having, just because of who I am and my experience. But more and more these days, there is innovation happening on the ground. In fact, there's more innovation happening on the ground than there is happening in the developed countries. And there is a frugal or otherwise, and there is a recognition that is happening, especially as and I think people are then willing to open minds and say, look, we don't have to follow the same model as the industrial. We can leapfrog in many different ways. And I think that confidence is coming in some of the bigger countries, especially the BRIC countries like India and China. I see the opposite. Now they feel like many times, rather than have the knowledge around, say, a sectoral area, they come to me, and this is the genesis of the book. They say, we have a lot of knowledge and information and innovation happening on the ground, whether it's water or whatever. But where we need help with is on this whole digital and blended learning, because we don't have that knowledge and we want to move fast. So there is a recognition and this change happening among the bigger countries. But then you have this, some of the smaller countries, I think, has to evolve through a show and tell process. So I did tell you when I was having an interview with Foster from the African Development Bank, he made a point to say that many of the countries in Africa are rejecting EdTech that comes out of the box, but need to have, and so they're looking at local innovation. So I think that but then you come to the other part about, I want to 10 Harvards, and that is a different story, because yes, they feel like that stamp of a Harvard opens doors, links to prime positions, and so on. And so that is something that continues to remain, and there is resistance. But lots of things are happening, right? Harvards and Columbias and MITs are also offering their MOOCs and so on, which people are participating. They have satellite offices. And one of the things, and I can speak from India's point of view, and I'm sure Punya would also agree, that investment of a very high quality Harvard model through our Indian Institute of Technology has paid a huge dividend in having such a sort of successful impact on skills development and so on. So I think Harvard will remain Harvard, and so I think people aspire to that. But on the issue of leapfrogging, I think people are open to that.
We're going to go over to Punya.
Thank you, Kurt, and thank you, Sheila, for that. When I put this thing on the chat on the side, sort of in relevance to your question, is that, you know, for many countries, telecommunication technology, I think, is a good example of where there was this complete leapfrog, which went from, like, Bangladesh, I think, is a great example, where you had terrible sort of landline telephone infrastructure, and within less than a decade, you went completely to, you know, cell phones. So, you know, so there are a lot of these examples. And one of my favorite examples of sort of ground up innovation is this thing called missed call, which anybody who's from India would understand, which is this way of communicating with other people without actually talking to them, by calling and then hanging up. And that basically sends a message saying that, it's like a parent would tell their kid, like, once, if you're going somewhere, send me a missed call. You know, and I've always thought of that as such a cute innovation. And there is some statistics on this, that at one point I think in Bangladesh, a significant percentage of the cell phone communication was basically missed calls. You know, so you do see these sort of ground up innovations, which are, I think, like, really just fascinating. But Priyank has, I think, a very interesting question where he asks that, you know, there is this sort of give and take between sort of the global and the vision that the World Bank has and what sort of the local are. So he asked, do you think governments tend to align their policies in accordance with sort of what the World Bank, because there is money involved, and what kind of implications do you think that has overall?
And I think, thank you. So the question is on the ground innovation in the developing world. I mean, so we're in an environment globally where, as I said when I started, availability of financing is available everywhere. So because World Bank gives out loans, it's not free money except for certain what we call the IDA countries. And so there are some sort of areas where the World Bank will sort of insist on things like, safeguards and safeguard of not just the environment, but gender inclusion and all of that. But beyond that, I use the word co-create solutions with our clients, and that's what's happening. So I don't think what the World Bank does is provide the loans and the financing, but also what they bring is the global experience. And so if we are working on Vietnam, we can bring experiences in that sector, whether it's education or sanitation, on what neighboring countries have done, where have they failed, what have been their challenges, how do you plan for this, so that you're not wasting the time reinventing. So the point is, ground up innovation is very much encouraged. And, we use the term global, right? It's a combination of global and local. And so that is also very much. Now, coming to the more generally on our operation project, I want to leave with one thought on that topic. So one other thing we do is the Open Learning Campus collaborates and has partnerships with what I call centers of excellence worldwide. So I mentioned we have collaboration with Tsinghua University, with the Chinese Academy of Governance, which is like the civil service training and so on. So we're not delivering all the training. Let's say when China had this huge urbanization about 15 years ago, they had millions of civil servants they had to train on urban development and land use and so on. They took the global content from us, and then these centers, the Chinese Academy of Governance, not only localized it to Chinese dialects, but they also put in local examples, local case studies, because that will only make sense. You can't take everything global. And so from day one, similarly, we have partnership, let's say in India, with the IAS Academy in Missouri, with the Urban Institute of Health Affairs, Land Use, etc. So worldwide, we have partnerships that scale and customize and bring the local experiences, not through us, but through our partners.
Thank you.
I think Chris and I both have short questions. I think we should go to Chris's before mine. Chris, why don't you go ahead?
Well, Sheila, it's inspiring what you described when you talked about the evolution over the 20 years at the World Bank, because there are lots of people and lots of institutions that build something and then it just stays the same forever and gradually gets more and more outdated and more out of touch with what's needed. And I love the way that you and your colleagues have kept evolving. So 3 to 5 years from now, could you speculate on, what you might be doing that's beyond today in some way or another, not as a commitment, but just as kind of an interesting visioning exercise?
Sure, Chris, and I'll make it short. So yes, we've been fortunate enough to constantly innovate because the world of technology is evolving and the pedagogy is also evolving. So, we're able to do that. So one area that we've already started dabbling with is AI. And so definitely much more on AI currently, more on adaptive learning. So not this one size fit all. So we've already started working with some adaptive learning. Funnily enough, the audience with whom we piloted didn't enjoy the adaptive experience as much as I thought they would. So that's a whole research area that we need. We did it on the subject of urban regeneration for urban specialists. And so, check where you are, identify your confidence level, and then the learning happens. So certainly more adaptive learning. Also the use of AI throughout the whole life cycle of learning. I'm already exploring with chatbots and tutor bots, but I think we can do so much more in the area of nudging and completions and so on. And the other area I mentioned is we are working on immersive learning, but I think immersive learning also needs to be a lot less expensive and easier to develop. And so I'm looking forward to more tools that will bring those mainstream. It's still expensive. But I think, again, and the whole social learning, we innovated with that right from the start because of our, who our audience is. But I'd love to do more around this area of interactions between expert and learner to learner, lot more and easier so that it becomes a natural, especially as we're dealing with millenniums and others who are used to all of this. We need to make learning more. And so I'd like to evolve. And lastly, I think I mentioned this, I'd like to go to evidence-based learning and learning from data. And it's not about data science or data analytics, but bringing data in everything we teach, real-time data. So, and then more on voice and so on and so forth. And just a tidbit, the period when I was doing my master's and doctoral work where I took the course with Seymour Papert, that was the time almost 35 years ago where we talked, one of my areas that I was working on was intelligent tutoring, which I'm sure you all know. And Chris, my friend Marsha, I think Marsha Marinich was your doctoral student long before I met you. So that's an area I'd like to do more of. We talked about it 35 years ago and we still don't have the right formula for that and do it right. So those are some areas. Of course, we don't even know what we don't know. So we'll have to see. Massive skilling and upskilling, not just for the fourth industrial, but also for the climate aspects, as well as for the SDG and for the youth bulge. So it's an imperative, most institutions like the World Bank and academia cannot rely on face-to-face. We have to go blended because of the skilling challenge.
Oh, and you have a really strong foundation now for all those innovations because the hybrid and online gives you the data streams that you need for AI and for a lot of the other things that you've described. The book that I co-edited before the most recent book on lifelong learning was on engineering learning, which relies on taking those data streams and then personalizing the individual experience, not just adapting, but truly personalizing. Anyway, Kurt, you had a question?
I did, but I know Punya also had an AI question, and so I want to make sure that that Punya asks it's going to be related to yours.
No, I think Sheila, you just answered the question without my having asked it, so that's perfect. So go ahead, Kurt.
Well, you've mentioned all the things for the future. You've mentioned all the stuff from the past and the present. People, every time that I tell my doctoral students about you, or I tell my friends about you, they say to me, how can I get a job at the World Bank doing what she's doing? I've sent you many names of many people, and you've hired a couple of them to do internships with you, in fact. And we'll have people watch the show later who might be interested in that. Can you talk a little bit about your serendipity in entering this field and how someone might make them marketable to get into doing what you're doing, whether it's UNESCO, the World Bank, United Nations, wherever? Can you give people some hints or guides what they might do?
Sure. At the end of the day, the World Bank is a bank. And so there's not a huge department for what we do. I think I've been fortunate to think through some agile ways to make the impact and our presence felt, because otherwise, what does the World Bank care about educational in this field? Of course, we have our education sector that deals with loans around all K through 12 academia. So I'll just break it down into the broad education space. I think it is tough to get a job in the bank. We have our young professionals program, and I think the age limit for that might be just under 30, but they'll have to check. It's hugely competitive, so that's one area. And the young professional program is the creme de la creme. So you get into it, and then it's like an executive program where the World Bank, you build your career within the World Bank, and and there's a lot of scaffolding and so on, but it's hugely competitive. So all of the same things apply, let's say to get into Harvard or to get into Indiana and others, is a strong educational background in the sector that they're applying. So in this case, education, with a specialization in whatever it is they're doing. And then World Bank rarely hires anyone, even at the young professional program, without any experience. So a ton of experience, solid experience in that sector. And of course, a knowledge of development, a knowledge of cross-sectoral, because today, and this is another thing that I bring up in our book, is this sort of siloized people, is that notion is sort of disappearing. Everything is linked to everything else. And so when you have this cross-sectoral sort of capabilities, you become more attractive. So I'll stop there. I mean, I've got right now, just to say, I've got 3 interns from MIT who are working. I mean, they're doing solid stuff working with me, but come totally free. So, at the internship level, people just want the experience of working on interesting things.
Yeah, so they can contact you about the internship possibilities, and things come up from time to time. We need to close. We have a couple minutes, maybe a minute left here. Robert Nelson has a question. He's saying, what are the critical components needed to sustain powerful learning initiatives? That's a big question. I don't want you, do you have a couple quick thoughts to address this question?
So I think it went back when I talked a little bit when Chris asked the question about pedagogy. I think at the learning level, you need to have a few pillars, very good pedagogy. It's not about, that's engaging, that's interactive, that's social, and so on. You also need good content, cutting edge content that mixes global and local and brings that different perspective, the cross-sectoral perspective. You need the appropriate technology to make all this work if it's not an in-person. But in addition, I think the scaffolding of the learner, we find that initially, if you don't have the scaffolding of the learner, they may turn away from the experience for life. And so we need to do that. But I also find lately for projects like the ones we are talking, complex development challenge, you need a lot of follow-up. It's not like, you do a course and I'm done. There's a lot of follow-up needed that can be done. If you think of a virtual scenario, you can follow up through regular webinars to update them on stuff, small group conversations, communities of practice, because that's the time when people are actually putting to practice what they learn. And sort of underlining all this, I mean, at least in the areas we work in, it's not anymore about theoretical content or theoretical learning, but it has to be very much aligned to the practical real life tasks. And also, we need to reimagine assessments, to make them more authentic and continuous and rather one-off. So lots of things. I mean, I would package that under the pedagogy, but it could appear very seemingly simple, but it's quite a complicated process to put together a program for sustainable change.
Well, I've been delighted to have you on the show, and I'm sure that Punya, Chris, Young, and Chang'e, and Scott, who's not with us, but he'll watch the recording today, all appreciate what you've had to say during the entire hour. Everything's been enlightening and illuminating. We've all learned a lot, and we're all going to learn more from your continued efforts and from your book that's coming up. Whether the title is still evolving or rethinking the title, it'll have a title someday.
I think Still Evolving is a great title.
Absolutely. Maybe that should be the.
That's the title. It's still evolving, because I think we are in that context, ongoing, have been for a while, and will continue to be. So, just kidding there. But I think there is a germ of truth to that. Chris, I think you need to introduce our next guests.
Yes.
Well, this has been an exciting episode because we've had a truly global perspective. And next week, back to back, we're going to have another truly global perspective because Rebecca Winthrop and Jenny Perlman Robinson from the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution will be our guests. They've written some powerful reports over the years on scaling, particularly in global South countries. And the most recent report is how the pandemic can actually accelerate the scaling of educational innovations, a theme that's near and dear to the hearts of people in this initiative. So I'm really looking forward to hosting that episode and hope that you will join us for that next week.
And Chris, you've already posted a blog post, so people can already get the information, get the bios, and hear about Millions Learning. And we've had a series of sessions here on the Global South, if you think about it, with the people from the Southeast Asia, and now with Sheila at the World Bank, and with next week thinking about marginalized, disadvantaged populations and what is happening around the world. So it's exciting. Again, I want to thank Sheila and give her a round of applause, and I want to call an end to episode number 30, and we'll see you all next week, episode 31.